Yesterday, I was interviewed by a high school student regarding my adoption story. And as I was sitting there FaceTiming him, answering all of his questions, some of his questions really were thought provoking and reminded me that I haven't talked about the chapter of my life that I talked about really openly years ago. And that is the fact that I'm an international adoptee. I have been sharing my life very publicly for the last 8 years. And I sometimes assume that everybody knows every part of my story. And at the same time, sometimes I think that everybody's heard my story and is tired of it. And I'm reminded all the time by people that they need updates. So funny thing is, shortly after I ended the interview yesterday afternoon, I was looking at my Facebook memories and I saw that on this day, 5 years ago, I shared a video that I made about my adoption. And it was the first time I had talked about it publicly. So a little bit about me. I was adopted at 9.5 months old. I was born somewhere in South Korea. And I was shipped over to the United States and adopted by a Caucasian couple that had been struggling with infertility for over a decade. People always ask, did you know you were adopted? Well, if you look at me and if you consider the fact that I had two white American parents, it was something that could have never been kept a secret. I don't ever remember a time when somebody sat down and said, Mindy, I just wanted to let you know you were adopted. It was just something that was always there. Anytime we went in public, there was always questions asked, and it's crazy as a child what it feels like to have people talking about you, around you, but not to you. And it's really crazy how intrusive people can be when they're curious about something. But there was always the, she was adopted, and there was questions surrounding my adoption, and there was always this is Dave and Luann and their adopted daughter. And one of the things in the interview yesterday with this high school student was, that topic got brought up. And I said, it's funny because when I go places with, my children, you don't have to make this like big production. You're like, just, these are my kids. But there was always this big thing of like, here's Mindy, the adoptee. And there was always this emphasis on that, wow, this couple, how fortunate this child was able to be adopted, and, all their dreams are, to be made come true. And so I always remember that adoption was just a subject that always got brought up. And for me, that was my normal. And at the same time, part of the conversation that always got brought up was, do you want to find your biological family? And people would always, that was the one question they'd ask me, like, do you want to find your, real mom and dad whenever you grow up? And that was always when my adopted mother would interject. Like, that was like, off limits. We didn't talk about it. There was no support or any mention of later on, if you want to find out about your heritage, your culture, go back to Korea, find, some of your biological, family, or try to, we'll support you. It was always one of those off limits topics. I remember watching movies like Unsolved Mysteries, and they would have, these like stories of these people who had been reconnected to their birth families. And my mom would always turn off the TV at the time. And so one of the questions that the student was asking me was, were you, made aware of your culture? And I was like, no, there was never anything besides the fact that my mom dressed me up in a kimono and took pictures of me at age 4. That was like the only type of thing that was ever made known as far as my culture. And then she would wear a kimono sometimes as a child when we would have this like elaborate dinner on the day that they brought me home when they adopted me. But that was it. I was asked by this student, which is super cool because this is a senior project, and I had to do the same thing my senior year to graduate. And as I was telling him a little about this, in my story, because he was asking like, how old were you when you were adopted? And I shared with him that I left home at 15, and I had to kind of recount the story. And I told him, I'm like, he asked how I did socially, due to my being adopted. And I explained to him that I lived a pretty sheltered life because, number one, I believe it had nothing to do with being adopted. I was raised by parents that are Jehovah's Witness. They still are of that faith. And so we didn't have a lot of connection with the outside world besides For me, once I started school at 4 years old, I had every Monday through Friday, the school hours. And then the rest of the time, it was just my mother, my father, and I. And then 3 days a week, we would attend the Jehovah's Witness. They call them meetings. It's just church, whatever. But I went to school when I was 4, and my mom had to spend a lot of time with me, educating me, because she was a stay-at-home mom, and that was really important to her. And I'm thankful that, she did teach me these things. But I went into school at 4, and there was early signs at that age of OCD. And there was such an emphasis, even at 4 and 5, for me to be perfect. I remember breaking out in hives all the time. I remember being nervous and having stomach aches. I remember the teachers talking to my mom about certain behaviors that they kind of thought was a little off, and nobody ever addressed it. But, the student that was interviewing me said, how did this affect you socially? I'm like, well, I went in at 4, and I had no interaction with any other children. I was living a very secluded life. And then on top of it, I didn't look like anybody. And then because of the religious aspect, every time that there was a birthday, every time there was a holiday, I was yanked out of the classroom. So I was already kind of a weirdo. I was already different. And then here I am, not being involved in, activities that other people were. And so when I went back to school after the summer break in 1st grade, it was very clear that I was not being challenged. So there was some test administered, and apparently in 1st grade at 5.5, I was reading at a 5th grade level. So they moved me to the 2nd grade. So here I was, 5.5, with 7-year-olds. And so, I told him that I'm not sure if it was because of being Asian or being adopted, or it was just the fact that I lived a life where I was, monitored differently because of the religion. I don't know. Nobody ever knows why things are the way they are. But either way, I never seemed to match the class that I went to school with or graduated with intellectually and emotionally. I on the education level was way far advanced compared to the people in my class, but emotionally I was super regressed. And it got more and more apparent the older I got, and I never fit in. I remember coming back every Christmas break and people, talking about the vacations they went to, the time they spent with their cousins or their grandparents, the presents that they got. And there was always like, Mindy, how about you? And then I would explain to them, oh, I'm a Jehovah's, either I'd lie, or I would say, I was a Jehovah's Witness, we are not allowed to, and then be like, oh, I'm so sorry for you, doesn't it suck? And I had it programmed in my head because it was what my mom said. It was like, oh, that's my faith, it's no big deal. And to a degree, it was not a big deal because that was all I ever knew. But once I hit high school, it became extremely hard because at any age, I think, or any household, vibe, any person that age starts to want to be independent. And at that age, I really wanted to fit in. He'd asked me how I had done in the interview. He asked me how I did intellectually, and I'm like, there was no delay cognitive wise. I was, above average in, all of my studies, and it got to the point where I was in the honor roll, year after year after year after year. And I remember in 7th grade purposely trying to fail because everybody made fun of me for being a goody-goody, a nerd, all these different things. And I just wanted to fit in, even if that meant, failing or being an average student. And by the time I hit high school, I wanted so hard to fit in, to be like people. I just wanted to go to high school football games, basketball games. I wanted to be a cheerleader. I wanted to play softball. I wanted to date boys. I wanted to be part of the yearbook club. And I didn't get to do any of that. And I honestly don't believe that it was because I was an adoptee, but I do believe it had everything to do with being raised as a Jehovah's Witness, and you coupled the two, and the need for me to fit in was so great. And so I was telling him that, on top of that, he said, was fitness something you always poured yourself into because of the stress and the anxiety and not being able to fit in? And I was like, no, because athleticism or any type of athletics was never allowed in my, youth, but it's something I got into as an adult. And I never realized until I started my fitness journey 8 years ago about how empowering it could be, that I never had self-confidence that was built up or instilled in me by my parents. I never had any type of camaraderie, being part of any clubs, and I was sharing that in school. I still see to this day on social media that there's people that they went through cheerleading together, volleyball together. They had, slumber parties all the time, and they are still, we're in our late 30s, early 40s, and they have these strong connections, and I have none. I have people that I'm familiar with, I went all through school with, we like one another, but there's no connection there. But once I got into the fitness realm, I started to build confidence, and then I became part of this community that has completely changed me. Is that for the first time in my life, I belong somewhere. I have a community of people that I am part of. I'm part of a company. I'm part of a movement. We have this one mission. And so for me, people ask, how have you stuck to what you're doing for so long? Why are you so into what you do? And, it is a stress reliever. It is the first time I was really good at something. It brought me happiness. It brought me, that togetherness. It brought me to be part of something bigger than I had ever been. And that is why I'm still here. It started off just a completely a vanity thing, but then it turned into something that just really filled this deep hole in my life, in my soul. And one of the things that I had shared in my first video that I shared exactly 5 years ago was that I had started joining these groups on Facebook that I didn't even know existed, and I think they were relatively new, where it was, all Korean adoptees. And joining it was really comforting, but at the same time saddening. It just depends on your perspective. But I joined these groups, and I met all these Korean adoptees, and I had never had that. I had never had that resource available. I didn't know. So my whole entire life, I felt crazy because I never felt loved. I felt like I was abused mentally, physically, and emotionally. I was expected to be perfect. I was expected to, do a certain thing to make my parents look a certain way. Just as a couple, as well as religion wise. And then here I am with all these adoptees, and I started listening to their stories, and I realized that everything that I felt off about, felt ashamed about, felt like I was crazy about, were pretty standard. And so it's unfortunate that a lot of us had that, but at the same time, I'm like, I'm not crazy anymore. And so it was really, I don't know, it was just like a relief, I'm not nuts. And so, he was asking what it was like to be around the adoptees for the first time and if it changed anything. And I mean, it did, because I, for once, didn't feel alone. It kind of validated my feelings. But at the same time, it opened up these doors, and there was conversations that became major triggers for me. And it did, end up in a pretty severe depression at the same time, especially because being part of this group prompted me to trying to find my birth family. And that was one of these things that the question kept coming up in this interview yesterday was what would you do if you found your birth family, and what measures have you went to? And so in 2012 and 2013, and this is what I was encouraged today to update. In 2012 and 2013, I started digging into my adoption because I was trying to get my passport, because my adopted parents had destroyed my naturalization certificate. So I had to go through all these hoops for 11 months trying to prove my citizenship, to get a passport, to go on a company related trip. And so while I was there, I started, digging into my adoption. And then in 2014, whenever I joined these groups, people were talking about the DNA testing. So by 2014, I had finally gotten my hands on some parts of my adoption, which is just crazy to look at. Your existence is like a file of papers. But I did a DNA test, and then I did another DNA test, and over the course of about 2 years, I contacted agencies in Korea. And the high schooler that was interviewing me yesterday said, what happened? And I'm like, nothing. Every time I tried, it came back with, we have no record of you. So there's no record in Korea that I even exist. We have no record of the hospital that the paper said you were born at. We have no record of the foster family that was listed on here. We have no record of your mother. And then all of these, the 2 sites that I uploaded, or the 3 sites that I uploaded my DNA to has only brought me close to cousins. And I'm talking about 5th to 7th distant cousins. So it hasn't brought me close to anything. And, he asked me, he's like, what would you do if you found, your biological family? And I told him, to be honest, right now, if I got an email that said, hey, we've matched you to a half brother, half sister, your birth mother or birth father, I would definitely contact that, the individual, and to try to see some, if we could connect on some level. He asked if I'd ever thought about going back to Korea. And I said, at this point, I have this conversation almost weekly with other adoptees. I have no desire to go to Korea. I never have, and a lot can change. But the last time I tried to contact the agencies in Korea, they again reaffirmed that there was no record of me. But if I came to Korea, they would look a little bit harder, and they might be able to find some information. I'm like, dude, fuck you. I'm not going to travel all the way to Korea and be a stranger in my home country that discarded me and go through like the whole language barrier and stuff in hopes that you can find information that you've obviously not tried hard to find these 3 times I have reached out to you. And I've seen from other adoptees that when they get there and they've, spent their money there, then they find stuff and it's not even accurate, or they have found their birth family and it's very discouraging. And so I've decided, and this is what I told them, I've decided that I am not at this point interested in going to Korea, spending any of my time or hard-earned money to spend in that country. And I'm not going to go to any great lengths to continue to find somebody that I am related to closely biologically. If it happens, it happens. I am curious if I ever were to find my birth family, because I read a book about 4 years ago that explained the physiological effects when a child is put up for adoption. And it really, I did see how that it is true because of the births of my 3 children, that apparently our bodies are so crazy the way we're created. But when a woman has a baby, and it's always encouraged that they're placed, skin to skin, on their chest immediately, that there is some sort of something like hormonally released where when the mother and the child are connected, the stress levels immediately go down. I realized that when Haley was born, there was a lot of complications. She was taken from me right away, and taken care of. I was taken care of, and she was my only child that was colicky, that had sleep issues. My other children were put on my chest right away. I was able to breastfeed immediately. They were very calm. And maybe it's a coincidence, but all my life I've had this anxiety and this hole in me that I really can't even explain, but I feel like I've always explained it, of how they say that if there's an animal that gets lost from their home, they will have this innate sense of trying to find their home. And a lot of times, there's stories of animals ending up, states or thousands of miles away from where they had been lost from. And I feel like that I've always been searching for that, or I feel like I'm searching for something. And I always wonder if it's my innate, body's response to looking for my birth mother. It's just a speculation, and that's what pretty much my whole entire life has been, is speculation. But I've always wondered, if I were to find my birth mother, would I feel like that? Would there be this feeling? Would that hole be empty, or filled for the first time? I don't know. And a lot of the questions he was asking me yesterday, I'm just kind of like, it's all speculation, about, he's like, how do you think if you had have been encouraged to, or been subject to your culture? And I'm like, I don't know. And that's the problem with my life, is there's just been these big question marks. But he asked me if there's any ill feelings towards my adopted parents. I'm like, I've wavered back and forth between hate, anger, guilt, whatever. And he said, have they ever apologized to you? I'm like, no, they never have. And as a parent, I think, I would move heavens and earth. I would apologize even if I knew 100% I wasn't wrong, to try to fix something to have my children in my life. And they told me my whole entire life, we love you like we're our own. And honestly, I can say that unless you actually have your own and have an adopted kid, you can't actually say that. And I've never had to tell my children I love them in that context, that if it is your real child and you really love them, you don't have to do that. I do think that 100% they did the best they could. But at the same time, I think that they had these, this ideal life that they wanted a baby to fit into that, and they were unrealistic. And when they got me, I think that I was a huge disappointment. But at the same time, they were kind of stuck. They spent all these years, praying, wishing, hoping, spending, money and time to become parents, that, they just had to make it work. One of the last questions he asked me was, would you ever adopt a child? And I feel very strongly. I mean, number one, I'm done having kids. I'm 39 and I have a 20-year-old and 2 other kids. I'm not going to start over again, but I've never had the desire to adopt. I have friends who have adopted. I see people who talk about adoption, and I think that's great. I would never adopt. I would never adopt. And, there's different reasons for that. But, I did tell him that once I kind of accepted all of this, I do feel like me opening up and sharing my story, even though I'm sure it rubs some people wrong, because I've actually had people reach out to me and tell me they've deleted me on Facebook or Instagram because I talk about my adoption. I still never understand why people have to tell you they're going to unfollow you, just unfollow you. But some people don't like that I talk about it. But me openly talking about it is cathartic. It has helped me, reach other people where we support one another. It's helped me help other people who weren't even necessarily adopted in the way that I was adopted, but they were adopted by a step parent, or they had a mother or father that abandoned them. So it's been very helpful sharing that part of my story. But I've also had a lot of friends or people that have followed me that were starting the adoption process or had adopted a child and have reached out to me, saying I've heard your story. I don't want that for my child. What can I do? And I can't speak for that child. And that's the whole thing about adoption, is there's these strangers that make these decisions for usually an unborn or a very small child. And it's just a gamble. And I know it's a gamble if you have a child of your own, but I can't speak for these children, but I do try to give some tips on things that were pretty, difficult for me growing up as an adoptee. And so I'm always happy to share my story to help people, and hopefully that the fact that they have reached out to me means that they will try a little bit harder than I think my parents had or did. And I think that nowadays more people talking about the, what adoption did to them, can spread awareness so that people are more prepared to help their child in this world, because we already have, no matter what, you have it rough in this day and age we live in, and then you add the physiological issues that come from being adopted. You deal with, if you're it's a international adoption and you're growing up like me, you walk up to me on the street, I just look like you're typical Asian, and then I open my mouth and you're around me and I act like a white girl, I think I'm a white girl. That's difficult. So knowing how to help your child if you're adopting them because of somebody like me and others sharing our story, I think is important, because it really affects your mental health. So anyways, I was asked to do an update, and I realized I hadn't really talked about this in 5 years, and who knows what another 5 years will bring. Maybe I'll want to go back to Korea. Maybe I will have found closer biological family members. But if you're thinking about adopting, definitely, I don't know what the adoption process is like now. And I think from every agency, it's probably different. But definitely educate yourself on the effects that adoption has on the child and the parent, because I think that it, as a parent who has 9 months to carry a child and prepare for it, you're still not always prepared for the shock that bringing a baby home can have. But definitely look into that, and always be looking for signs to help your child acclimate better into your home, into society, and just, always reinforce that you love them, and that's something that's super important, whether your child is biologically yours or adopted. So anyways, if you have any questions, just reach out to me.